Okay, we're at a job site where we're working on a basement for a house that's going to be moved in about 16 miles east of here. And there's a couple things. We're going to take you down in the hole here in a little bit, but to start with, I wanted to point out the ramp that we use for access. We put it there very specifically. The reason is that you want, and I'll show a drawing later on, but you want it on a corner, which is the strongest point. You don't want to put it in the center of a wall or something, because the compacted soil will act like a wedge and shove that dirt as it settles towards the house. So we'll go down inside and we'll look closer at the footings.
Stewardship is everything.
These are the footings that we put in for the basement wall, and these footings are 24 inches wide and 8 inches deep, and they have said that the rule of thumb is that the footing should be as thick as the wall is thick and twice the width. But my conclusion is, over the years, is that the rule of thumb is there is no rule of thumb, because obviously this footing is going to support only a single-story house. But if it was going to be a 3-story house, you would need a lot more footing underneath it. So this is sufficient for what we're doing, and the wall that we're going to put on there is an 8-inch ICF wall. So the total width of the wall is going to be 13¼ inches wide, but the concrete core is 8 inches. And we'll show you that process when we get to that step. We're just getting ready to pour the floor and compacting the dirt around the side of the footing to make sure it's secure. One of the things that we do when we put this footing in is that it's reinforced with number 4 grade 60 rebar, and that keeps the footing intact, and it also increases the ability to bear weight and spread it out. The reason that you use a spread footing is that basically it spreads the weight of the house or the structure above it. And the reason that there's no rule of thumb to say is that the footing depends on what you're going to set on it, but also the compaction of the dirt that's underneath it. So you have to know what those two things are to really design an adequate footing. One of the things when you're building that you do not want to cut corners on is the footing, because this is what the whole structure rests on. And if you get this wrong, you'll fight it clear to the peak of the roof. So it's very important to spend a lot of time making sure the footings are square and plumb, and or level, I should say. And one of the ways modern day to do that is with a laser such as this, where you can set that up and find out exactly where you're at. This says this right here is 0.05 low, and you really want a constant. Right there is dead level. But if you get that close, it's about as close as you can be. Someone once said there's no such thing as 1/8 of an inch in concrete work, but that might not be true. So that's a very tedious part, and once you get the footings in and they're flat and they're level, from there on the rest of the structure comes together pretty fast. Okay, as we talked about earlier, I was going to show you a diagram of what I was trying to describe with the ramp that goes down into the basement. And here's the basement wall, and this is the, we overdig it so you can get in, put your waterproofing on, and work on the walls and everything. So what you don't want to do is put your ramp out here in the middle, because what that does is if that settles, and I'll show you what I mean by that, it keeps pushing on that wall. So the strongest point is right here in the corner. So ideally you'd want your ramp to come in like that, but sometimes that's not possible. So like we did on this project, our ramp actually comes in like this. Now sometimes you can't avoid putting the ramp in the middle of the wall. We had a situation like that last year where we had the house jacked up and we were putting the basement underneath it, and the cribbing was in the corners of the house that we had jacked up. So obviously you couldn't put a ramp there, so we had to put it in the center of the wall. And I'll describe how to resolve that problem. And I'm going to change my drawing here. Okay, with this drawing, it's kind of a cross section. Here's the basement wall. Here's the dirt bank and our overdig here. This is elevation, or this is ground level. And this is our ramp. And what happens when you begin to fill that in, because you've been driving up and down on this ramp, this soil becomes very compacted. So what happens is, as you start backfilling this, as that settles, it wants to follow that, and it'll put an incredible amount of pressure on the side of your wall. That's why you want it in a corner, because that's the strongest point. Now, as I mentioned last year, when we couldn't avoid it, had to be in the middle of the wall. What you want to do before you backfill is you want to take an excavator or whatever means you have and cut the bottom of that ramp back 4, 5, 6 feet, and you want it to be flat. So you're going to cut this part out. And you cut that out, and then when you backfill it, that soil is going to settle, and it's going to go down instead of sliding down that compacted soil into your wall. So just a little piece of information that can keep, if you put it in the middle of the wall instead of on a corner, it can keep you from having your basement wall bow in. So just a little more information. The place where this house is being set and these footings for the new house that's coming in, the existing house here was a large house that was built in the late 1800s. And just to give you an example of the kind of footings that they laid in the basement walls, they went out in the country and they found limestone rock like this, and then they would stack these rocks up. And they all had to be fit together, and where they couldn't come up with it, they would fill it in with this red brick. And this material is really quite soft. And this wall on this existing house was any place from 1.5 to 2 feet thick. And it stood here and it did not move for over 100 years. So that's very adequate. The reason we don't do this anymore is primarily because you couldn't afford to have this done, because it's incredibly labor intensive, and the material, the availability depends on where you live. And just as an example, part of that footing's still in the bank. You can see it right here where the limestone is still in there and the interlaced red brick that filled in the gaps between them. And then the surface on the inside and the outside would be plastered together to hold everything in place.
The original house on the property was built by W.H. Failing in the late 1890s. Failing was a local merchant who became one of the first chairmen of Cambridge. Failing built another home in Cambridge in 1909 that still stands today and serves as the Cambridge Historic Bed and Breakfast. More than 100 years later, my sister purchased the original first home Failing built. On New Year's Day, 2015, a log escaped the glass fireplace door and the home was lost to fire. The lot has sat empty except for a 2-car garage until now. The new house that will be moved onto the new foundation is for my niece and her family. The original house had been her childhood home, and now the property will be home to a 3rd generation.
Just a trick of the trade, I guess, when you're laying in plumbing and it's going to be embedded in the concrete slab. Make sure you get it set to elevation, cover the top up, but when you put the top tape on the top, leave it stick up above the pipe, about half the width of the tape. Then when you screed over the top of that, that'll fold down and it'll pop back up so you can find that pipe in the concrete. Also, if you've got a toilet flange, make sure you tape the bottom of the holes so that the concrete doesn't ooze up through that. That's it.
That's all we have for you today. Thanks for joining us. If you haven't subscribed, maybe do so you don't miss anything we have going on out here at Foundation Homestead or anywhere else. Have a good one. Bye.